Hello and welcome to the Inner Sense channel. Today we're joined by Burcu Tuncel, who practices a unique type of movement coaching which she calls Neurosensory Movement Coaching. Her approach allows people to change unhelpful movement patterns and form more helpful ones. Like me, she has an interest in the role of interoception and fascia in how we move. We covered lots of deeply related topics, and I was intrigued to hear from Burcu how architecture and landscape were used in ancient Rome to memorise stories and instructions in a kind of ritualistic way. Now, that might not seem like it has anything to do with movement coaching, but you'll find out the link in this interview. I hope you enjoy it, and please do subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more information about how you can improve your health and well-being. Hello, Burcu. Thank you for joining us today on the Inner Sense channel. I'm really looking forward to talking about your style of coaching and therapy, and maybe we'll discuss some interoception as we go along.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. It is a pleasure for me as well.
And it's a really I was just reflecting on this last night, how incredible it is these days to reach out to people in different parts of the world and in a very short space of time kind of get a nice conversation going and share knowledge and deepen each other's knowledge. So you reached out to me after sort of watching, I think it was maybe Robert Schlepp's video on fascia. And you, as we'll find out, you use kind of movement and fascial awareness in your coaching. And when I spoke to you a few weeks ago, we had a brief conversation, and I was really impressed with all the different kind of styles of sort of approaches that you've incorporated into your work. So maybe could we start by just hearing a little bit about your background and your training? You're based in Turkey, and how you incorporate all the things you've learned into your style of coaching, which you call neurosensory movement coaching.
Okay, so I am originally trained as an architect and later an architectural and art historian. But from starting in college, I've been practicing and teaching yoga. So that paved the way, turning yoga into a profession. And later on, I found fascia. And with the fascial knowledge, I really enriched my practice. And then many other things added up, like polyvagal theory or psychosensory motor therapy techniques and some other trainings. And the coaching was added at the last bit. And somehow I formed a new profession on conceptual movement, which exceeded yoga in the end. Mm-hmm. So I just do private sessions and group therapies as well. But my starting point is always actually movement. Mm-hmm. And the other expression styles, such as conversations or sometimes the artistic expressions, but generally I focus around movement, and we work on repatterning fascial tension points and other existential topics through this.
Great, and I hope to discuss all of those different things as we go along. So it's interesting you trained originally in architecture, you say. And I think of, I know an osteopath actually who trained, him and his wife originally trained in engineering, structural engineering. So it's interesting that he, when he views the body, you know, he's always thinking from an engineering point of view about forces and strain. And I can see maybe with a architecture background, you've got a kind of awareness of how structures can be formed And, from the fascia, it's, I like the idea of this biotensegrity with fascia, that we need just the right amount of pliability and integrity, but still to be able to move. So do you think your architecture training has influenced your work in therapy and coaching?
Yeah, probably, because as you know, the tensegrity is tension and integrity all together. And this was the first thing that we were introduced in architecture department. Yeah, and this was actually how I entered the world of fascia, because there I was introduced biotensegrity, which was really dynamic and fluid and much more complex than a rigid building, of course. But always I was fascinated by people more than the buildings. So yeah, that attraction actually naturally paved my way to this bodywork and the other types of therapies.
That's lovely to hear. So your neurosensory movement coaching, and you sent a little bit of information to me about this, and you distinguish coaching from mentoring and consultation. So can you say a little bit about how coaching, or your style of coaching, is maybe differs?
Okay. So actually, in coaching, for me, and as I was trained in terms of coaching, the aim is not to see the story, but to see the bigger picture, the individual behind of it, and to see the motives, the themes, the goals, a broader perspective. We look for it. But I use movement therapies and I use movement in general to figure out what would I ask, because there is no mind management or other kind of directioning in coaching. In mentoring or consultation, we can introduce some other ideas, or we can a little bit deconstruct the equality in terms of relationship. But in coaching, it's very important to sit at the same level and have a conversation on the same level. So this is how I aid coaching. But the coaching material for me comes from the bodywork and movement. So this is how it is different.
Okay. So the coach and the person being coached you view them as equal. And so, yeah, the movement side then. So is that in terms of the goal, that the bigger picture and the goal that you're working towards in a coaching setting is about movement? You set movement goals, do you?
Yeah, because I view movement as an expression of the mind, and mind is actually a mechanism that is programmed to create cycles, loops, events to sustain the reality, actually. And when you sustain the reality, you create also time, you construct the time, but at the same time, you make it a lot more complicated. So we try to stay in this moment, because it is already so complicated, and look at the habitual patterns, the sequential movements, units, and how each unit is being processed by the individual. And by that, by experience, I naturally know what to ask. So it really reduces my time spent and really makes it more efficient to do the coaching for me.
Mm-hmm. So you're looking out for patterns, and I guess if there's a goal, then you're kind of seeing which patterns can help a person move towards their movement goal, or if there's some obstacles in the way, maybe there's some patterns kind of holding people back or restricting their movement goals. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe partially, because sometimes a person's goal and their moving patterns, they contradict each other. You can also see that in the movement, but also there are really basic movement patterns, such as like pushing, yielding, grasping, surrendering, such types of movements. And we all of us from childhood naturally connect these one movement to another. But that type of connection is very authentic to individual, and it is different in every person. So I look at how do they build their own sequence, because this sequence is time bound, and people, they just create linear patterns while they bind these units. For some people, these are more inclined geometries, like circular geometries. For some people, there are large pauses and sudden movements, like more cornered architecture comes out from it. But if I look at linear perspective, which comes with the time, I don't want to do that because it is so complicated. But when I compress that movement and I just take a section from now, only now, this is where I can utilize fascia at its utmost potential. And we can see everything that person has, of course, through our own potential. Also, we are limited by ourselves at that point as well. But it is the most simplifying way to me to look at this manner to the body.
Mm-hmm. So you're focused on the present moment. You are treating yourself and the person being coached as equal on an equal level, and you're looking out for what is being presented in the body through movement or tension patterns right now, rather than worrying too much about past or future or other time. Okay.
No, because most of the times all of the narratives are not necessary, actually. Maybe we are stuck in only one point in the narrative, and it would be enough to take it and move to our future, towards our future. But when we dive into the narratives, we traumatize ourselves sometimes. So I find it a little bit unnecessary. And by building this type of connection, the connection remains a little bit more pure, and I can protect my own childish curiosity to keep on asking curious questions about that individual, because for me, the motive is just curiosity. And I try to see, I don't want to know about all of the stories, because it will make me a little bit distant. It will put me in a distant space to that person. But I don't want to lose that connection and intimacy. So I just focus on that individual as much as we can through that time span, because this also connection is a framework which is constructed only for that session and will be dissolved just after the session. Also, it is nice to have that elasticity. It is nice to give that elasticity to the bond as well for me. So this is how I work.
Nice. And you also distinguish between, so I'm a manual therapist, hands-on. I use a lot of touch, whereas yours is touch-free. Is that correct? So it's movement-based, but you don't use any hands-on manipulation or touch?
Yeah, generally I do not, because I do not want to interfere. But if we are at the very beginning, and if I want the client to learn a little bit about fascial chains, for instance, or if some muscles are needed to be activated and cannot be done without touching, I interfere at that moment. But the peak of the practice for me is the place where I only observe. And so that the client can observe the observer as well. I try to give that space to the client. If I am a part of the play, then I think that possibility really diminishes, which I don't prefer.
And so is this done sitting down or standing or moving around, or how do you, what does a typical session look like?
Normally, I'm a little bit loose on that, because we have the fascial movement principles without informing the client about all of the technical details, because also I find that technical details really reduce the intensity of the bond. So I do not tell about these technical details, but if the client is eligible for that, for instance, I can use the sensory refinement part of the fascia training, or I can fortify fascia a little bit on rebound elasticity exercises for some time, so that in the next session, we can use the full potential of fascial strength in a little bit longer class, maybe. So we are using like slow movements as well, also fascial stretches sometimes. Also classical yoga poses, but with fascial activation, which are a little bit different. I use sounds a lot.
Sound, did you say?
Yeah, sounds. I have like 15, 20 sounds that I use because normally there are like clinical explanations that which sound stimulates what. But sometimes the experience of client differs than that. They tell me a different story. So I investigate and we find something else from there.
So you, with the sounds, you are playing a sound externally to them, like through speakers, or you encourage them to make the sound? Are they generating the sound themselves?
No, I generally do not produce, I do not use external sounds generally, because also sound has a really powerful effect. Sometimes I do teach them chanting with my own voice, but I prefer them to hear their own voice because it is, I think, much more efficient than the other tools. So.
Okay.
They do
so so you ask them to make a sound.
Yes.
And do you have to demonstrate first? Do you have to sort of say, is it like a sigh or a roar or a like something that mimics?
It can be anything. Yeah, it can be anything. Yeah, I of course I demonstrate first because so many people, especially in these days, especially the stressful people, are not okay by hearing their own sounds. So first we have to reconcile that. So when they accept the fact that they have a sound for some people, but for some people it is really easy to do that. It is natural in them. That inner child still remains the same. So I don't have to do nearly anything with these kind of people. So these changes and also these types of personalities, we also wear them in our own lives from period to period. Also, this changes in our lives as well. So we do our best to take that potential out.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, this two-way reciprocal relationship between sound and movement and changes in the body, and as you said, cognitive outcomes of that. And I'm speaking to someone else at the moment about emotional goosebumps, which it's often experienced in the skin. So a tingling sensation if you listen to some powerful music, or maybe you're in deep conversation with someone and you say, "Oh, that sent shivers down my spine." So we were talking about that, and then also these. It got me thinking about sneezing and yawning and all of these movements, and when people wake up in the morning and maybe a big want to do a big sigh and a yawn. So sometimes a sound comes with these almost reflexive fascial kind of movements.
Yeah, sometimes these sounds are just disappeared from people's movement languages. So it is nice to keep in mind that we have these tools as well. So sometimes I need to remind people about these sounds because these are really powerful sounds. Like yawning is really powerful, stimulating for me. Also, the tingling effect that you just mentioned is a ventral vagal response in my perspective. So sometimes I find myself, of course, telling the importance of these things. This is probably the times where we break the equality, only times maybe. I find them really important and powerful.
Yeah, you just mentioned vagal response, and I know in your initial email, I think you mentioned you appreciate the polyvagal theory from Stephen Porges, and how we can be shifting state constantly depending on what we perceive is going on in our environment, whether it's a threat or safety or social engagement. All of these different modes of perceiving the world and acting in the world come with very real physical changes in our body, which could affect our posture or our voice, tone of voice. So it's an amazing dance, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, it is. It is, but also for posture, I see posture as a frozen impact of habitual patterns, because if you do not seeing what you're doing, and if it is frozen, it doesn't matter that you move. But if you are moving repeatedly and without noticing, acknowledging that, it is frozen in your posture as well. For me. So posture also, I think, should be a little bit more elastic and open for changes, and open for reacting as well.
I very much agree. And if a client comes to me with and they're in pain or whatever, and they say they're often almost beating themselves up by saying, my posture should be better, I should be straighter or whatever. And I often say, there is no perfect posture to be in all day long. And actually we do want to be quite fluid. So sometimes it's okay to slouch for a while, and other times being more upright. And as you're kind of indicating, there could be something more existential driving, or something more social driving these postures. So we don't, it's my opinion that we don't necessarily want to fight against the posture. If there's, if we don't aren't aware that there's a pattern driving the posture.
Yeah, it is saying something else, saying a message to us, conveying a message to us. And it actually determines our approach to life at that point in time. So it is nice to work with posture, and it is nice to also, I think, accepting some things. They might not change, and some things can change very rapidly. So it is really unique to each person. And for that elasticity, I also find it very important to work with interoception and proprioception as well. That also the neurological part of the practice, because these circuits, they really necessitate being taken care of regularly. So some people has hobbies to do that for them. Some people has more technical exercises. Some people has other tools, but it doesn't matter for me. But we have to do, I think, something to keep us uplifted. It can be a person, a nice nourishing conversation as well. It doesn't matter, but these are all somatic sources that keep us alive and motivated, and a little bit eligible to see the goodness in life. So
yeah, it's really a nice way of viewing, as you said, hobbies or exercises or whatever works for the person, really. And if we bring it back to this kind of basic idea of, as you said, feeling uplifted, that is an interoceptive sensation. And I feel anyway, that uplifting comes with a movement in the body. It's not just a kind of mentally uplifting, or it can be, I guess. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be allowed physically, but it feels to me like it wants to kind of be expressed as an open, uplifting movement. So, interoception. Then, what have you observed about this idea of anticipation? So, I'm guessing you're aware of this idea of a predictive nature of our nervous system, that the body and brain are kind of majority of the time trying to anticipate and forecast what's happening in the future. And to, so rather than waiting to react, we are anticipating the next move. And it's got various different names. Predictive processing, for example. Allostasis is another kind of related phenomena. So what have you observed about in your clients about how this can happen, and the role of feelings or interoceptive sensations in that story with fascia and posture and movement?
Actually, this is a really deep, deep topic, but I can go back to architecture to discuss that.
Please do.
In ancient Rome, politicians, they used buildings and cityscapes to memorize their speeches. And this type of planning the city was called mnemonic structuring, because they were creating a path for their gazes and they were attaching sentences to the landmarks and monuments. And so that they could memorize the whole sentence. I think our fascias work like that, but in a more sophisticated manner, because we do not have the cityscape, but we have all of the life itself. And also, this life is co-created by everyone who has ever lived and is about to come to the surface of the world, and all of the minds that are existent in this moment. So I think our fascias, in a more timeless manner, react to all of it. Only we cannot process maybe all of it, because it is also up to our body's quality, which is open to decay and open to the negative notions of time. So that impact can be changed, because this situation of our bodies in this state, in current position, determines our response to what our fascias observed. Mm-hmm. So this, I think, can be changed. If this can be changed, the anticipation of the body also can be changed, because it is connection and it is relation to fascia also becomes changed. But I think this is more like a neurological process in the brain, because you then come out of thinking and analyzing, but you reconnect and you become perceived. And this perception is immune to opposition. It is another kind of perception which changes oneself. And we have all of these chances to perceive in life. These are scattered images. And we look for it, I think, when we work something like interoception. I think it is the hidden driver for us to have a profession like that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So you started off talking about in Rome, did you say? The architecture in Rome? I've never heard that before, that the architecture was used to memorize or record sentences. So were they sentences about Rome and about the empire, or what sort of statements were stored in the architecture?
There were processional routes which were used, the paths that you walk in a ceremony. And then in Rome, they were utilizing all of the senses, actually. So they were creating a ritual for themselves. Mm-hmm. As the other parts of the country were so chaotic, mm-hmm. It was something to keep people in that moment and be without writing, maybe. And for the politicians, it was a pathway for the mind to remember and manage the minds. But what we do here is not mind managing, of course, because there is also a cunning aspect, because you are directing people to do what you like to do. But in fascia doesn't have to do anything, because I think it is connected to another reality, or the essence of the reality, which is not bound to this reality. So it is outsourced in that manner. You don't have to do anything to manage. You just can process and perceive as much as you can. But in Turkish, we have other words that comes from Sufism that aids me to tell these issues.
Sufism.
In Sufism, because there are also other levels of perception. Because when I say that I understand, I can also understand a mathematical problem, but someone in the future can come and say that I am mistaken and create another proof which totally deletes my understanding. This is not that kind of understanding that comes with the fascia. So we don't have to do anything to manage. We just can simplify, because um, everything else that doesn't come from there is very complicated and very far from being simple, which makes it really hard to process. And sometimes when we analyze, we create new realities, which means new anticipations for the body. And sometimes when we try to cure ourselves, we create new tensional patterns in the fascia for that reason, only by thinking. So I think, be a little bit careful about ourselves in that manner, while in terms of healing ourselves. Because I think simplicity is the key of it, always.
Yeah. So I like the, as you're describing that, I'm thinking about fascia as this kind of intermediary sort of material or state where, as you said, it's connected to it's kind of a junction between our fixed structures in our body and the outside world, and that interface between how we interact and move through the world. And also when you were talking about the architecture in Rome and that sort of kind of the sense of control, and the buildings are very fixed, aren't they? And I'm thinking about, our bones and our body. Bones are kind of maybe a little bit like those buildings. They're not complete. There is a cell turnover with osteoblasts and osteoclasts, but compared to fascia, the bones are very kind of like, they store the deepest, most solid memories of our existence, whereas like the skin has got a very high turnover, and fascia is kind of in between. So yeah, it's interesting to draw these parallels with how our human body and our cultural or societal body that we create through, as you said, cities and architecture and so on. And I'm also thinking here about the work of Carl Friston and free energy principle and active inference, where they've got this idea that for anything to exist, it has to have a model of itself inside of a model of the world and itself inside of it. And then it has to keep enacting this model to sustain it. So, I'm Ian and I'm a human, and therefore I need to eat and breathe and do all the things that Ian does. And that requires me to have a model of me and the world. But and I guess that's what in Rome, that's what the leaders of Rome were doing with their architecture, and wanting to encourage the citizens to cooperate.
Yeah. Also, from where I stand now, according to my current consciousness, I also see that free energy principle, something being triggered outside than this. But when I say this, I cannot identify. But also in terms of the body structure, when you think about fascia as an extension of the brain, this is why I call it neurosensory, because I think the brain is that magical aspect to it. But fascia even goes and crosses inside the bones. So it is not an obstacle for it. Anyways, of course, we have some roots or ancestors or like an inheritance, but for fascia, even that doesn't matter. We can change our biostructure, right?
Yeah.
We can change.
We can.
Yeah, we can. So you can be optimistic about it.
Oh yes, yeah. I'm sort of not so much pessimistic about it, and quite right. The fascia goes in and surrounds the brain and folds around every sort of, goes down the spinal column and around the. It's the sort of wrapping that goes in and around everything. But I like the idea that, as you said, it's an extension of the brain. So how do you encourage your the people you work with in a coaching environment to repattern, so that they overcome anything that's holding them back and help them work towards their goals?
First, I think repatterning necessitates acknowledging and then confrontation prior to change something. So I have to learn that they are willing to change or not. This is the first step, because sometimes people can seek something, but they can just give up their ideas, and that is also totally normal, I think. So I have to learn that. And when I introduce repatterning, we together seek a more simplified version of the same movement in a more efficient way, and without activating those tensional patterns. For instance, how I feel lateral line can change daily. So if I have a tensional thing or a chronic pain on my lateral line, and if I do not want to trigger it daily, if I want to stop it, if I have decided, because decision is I think, very important part of it, because when you decide, you have a chance to stop thinking, because you think, you create these tensional patterns. So if you can start thinking differently, you can stop it, and while you start practicing that in your habitual movements, you can be aware of yourself, and you can learn to, for instance, grab a plate from the cupboard, not like this, but more like from the sternum. So you can change how you act. You can do the same things, but you can do it in a more efficient way. So we look for these movements. We practice it in a more artistic way in the class, but I think where it functions best is when it is transferred into daily life, just in the example I just given.
Great. Yeah, I love that example of reaching for a plate. That there are so many ways to do it, and we will have these habitual ways, and which is great that we have habits, because it's at some point your body has worked out that this was, at that point in time, that was a useful, efficient way of doing it. But if it's now become a problem, how can we, take another route? And as you said, lead from rather than, this obvious reaching, lead in a slightly different way and work a way around the pain. Lovely.
Yeah, maybe in the past it was not possible to move from the heart, but now if it is possible, why not use it?
Great. Yes, yeah. So I'm thinking there that, you can take it as deep as the person wants to go. You can think of it practically as, I need to do this housework, or this, they may be an electrician who needs to use his arm for screw driving or wiring or whatever. So it can be a very immediate, practical route around it. Or, as you said, you could be looking for something more, a different quality that relates to something more emotional, like, leading from the heart or being with confidence. Have you looked into shamanic sort of principles at all?
Like which ones?
So the idea of in shamanism, you can sort of go on a journey in a meditative, relaxed meditative state. And often what I find intriguing is you can either choose to, in the journey, go underground, or you can go into an upper realm, like let's say a heavenly realm. And what I find interesting in the underground, often you're looking for an animal, a power animal, to give you a quality that you bring back into your everyday life. Whereas in the upper realm, it's more to do with making a decision. So you might want guidance from a wise person or God. So the way I interpret that is, in the underrealm, if people are looking for a power animal, it might be, let's say, the strength of a bear, or the wisdom, the vision of an eagle. And by bringing that back, they're embodying some change in movement, or some, opening up or strength. Whereas if they're going into the upper realm, it's more of a cognitive model. So should I take a job in London or should I move to Spain? So it's more of a cognitive solution. But yeah, as you were saying about leading from the heart, I was thinking about, some people using those techniques to get a quality from an animal.
Actually, I think it doesn't matter for me where you get the message from. You can go to anywhere, to any other realm, or speak to a solid person in front of you, or just experience something or observe something. It doesn't matter. But I think what matters is what you do afterwards, because you take a message or you embody a principle, like you said. But can you do it by being yourself? Or are you being directed by some other force? Because there is also a faulty pattern there which will lead to attentional pull in the end. Because it doesn't matter what message you get, but I think it really matters how you make a decision with it and where that decision comes from. Because sometimes we are not aware, but we do not live for ourselves. Our inner motives sometimes are not our own. And we are fascinated sometimes by these powerful rituals because they also have a really nice theatrical effect, of course, really fascinating. But if that destroys your own personality, and even for that time being, it will have consequences and everybody will face it sooner or later. So I think all rituals can be utilized because everything is for humanity, for you to take yourself from one point to somewhere else. But that choosing moment, actually, this is the very core of the being.
I love that kind of wisdom, and it's some kind of testimony to your awareness of how you're working, I think. And I agree with the idea of the rituals or the practice or the technique. It doesn't really matter. And what I hope is that more and more of these techniques and rituals, they can share and look for the common elements of what's actually going on between them. And that can be used, those commonalities can be used to help people understand what's really happening in a therapeutic setting or a coaching setting, or a personal development. All these things can be done on our own as well, without other people, if we choose. So yeah, really lovely insight there. Thank you. And you've really kind of clearly spent a lot of time thinking deeply about all of these things.
Thank you, Ian. It was a really nice conversation for me.
Yes, yeah. So where can people find out about your work?
I generally practice online. Sometimes I do have writings, but until now, I had very limited English writings. They were mostly in Turkish. But I practice online, and I have a website called Fascia Training. Okay. So people can find me there. And by just Googling my name with Fascia, they can find me easily. I do work generally in one-on-one environment and sometimes in groups. So to keep in touch with me, they can just email me.
Great. So are you happy for me to put your details on the description for this video?
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Burcu. And I'll hopefully stay in touch, and I wish you all the best for your work.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian.
Please remember to subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more information about the role of your bodily sensations and tips for using bodily awareness to improve your well-being.